Greetings and welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Philip Cass. I'm a historian, a dealer, an appraiser, and a scholar on old violins, and have been a friend and admirer of the Whitall collection for many, many decades now. We are here to listen to three of the greatest works for the chamber music repertoire, performed by four talented musicians who, through the magic of the string quartet, have coalesced into one voice, and performing on four of the greatest instruments in the world. And this is all possible through the vision of an extraordinary lady named Gertrude Clark Whitall. Let me tell you a little bit about Mrs. Whitall, who was born Gertrude Littlefield Clark in Bellevue, Nebraska in 1867. Her father was a rather extraordinary man. He was an engineer and an industrialist, and was responsible for the railroads and bridges across the Missouri, and even was instrumental in creating the Pony Express in Nebraska Territory. He also served in the legislature of Nebraska Territory before statehood. He was a philanthropist and was the sponsor and supporter of the fledgling universities that were opening in the territory of Nebraska during that same period. He shared this love of learning with his daughter, who he sent to a private school where she could be exposed to art and music and the humanities, and developed a great love for art and music and poetry. In addition, she was able to travel internationally, broadening her horizons, and in the course of visits to Europe and South America, developed fluency in both Spanish and French. In 1906, she married Matthew John Whitall, who was a prominent rug manufacturer from Britain, and the couple settled in Worcester, Massachusetts. Here she began to organize musicales, soirees for the pleasure of music. And in 1908, an important event happened in which the Franzollet Quartet visited and performed in her home. This created a lifelong love for the string quartet and its repertoire. And it left a very strong impression on her, at which she continued to try to support string quartets and young musicians. After her husband died in 1922, she moved to Boston to continue supporting the arts and music and continue to have soirees with string quartets in her home. This ultimately led to a series of progressions that resulted in her acquisition of the ensemble of Stradivari instruments that are here today, and the creation of a foundation to support them, to provide for their maintenance and for regular performances to the public through radio and concerts in this hall. Her love of music was not all of her devotion to the arts. She also supported the poetry and literature through the creation of a foundation to support these, also at the library. And in 1951, the Poetry Room was dedicated to her. She was a constant attendee at these concerts whenever possible, and attended right up until the very end. She died in 1965 at the tender age of 97. However, our story begins quite a bit earlier, in 1932, and it concerned her sponsorship of several very talented young musicians who were studying in Boston. The key figure became their teacher, because they were studying with another remarkable man named Louis Krasner. Louis Krasner was a very fine concert violinist who was building a career as a soloist in Europe, but in the off-season was teaching violin in Boston. during 1932, two of his finest students were actually being supported by Mrs. Whittall. One of those students required a better instrument, so Mrs. Whittall approached Louis about acquiring one for her. And the result of that was the purchase of a very fine Montagnana violin. Now, in the course of this, Mrs. Whittall was exposed to the world of violins, and through Louis, who had the instincts of a violin dealer, who understood the instruments and knew their history and their lore, and was able to share that with her, she developed a great love of the instruments themselves, as well as the music that's performed on them. So she admired the Italianate sound of the Montagnana, and eventually she started to include Louis and his string quartet in her musicales at home. On one of these occasions, she discovered that the violist in the quartet was the only member of the ensemble who did not play on an Italian instrument. She didn't feel this was appropriate, and so she asked Louis if he would find a fine Italian viola for this musician, which he was able to do, and which she then also acquired. And she was very proud of the fact that she had an ensemble performing entirely on Italian violins at her musicales. And as time went on, they became closer friends, and what they shared was the love of the music and the love of the instruments. Now, in the summer of 1933, she had the opportunity to travel to Italy with her niece and spend the summer in Florence, during which time she went to a great number of concerts and musical events, and also in the course of which she became friends with the cultural attaché of the consulate in Florence, a man named Henry Blakiston Wilkins, who lived in the DC area. She became close friends with him and his family, and she and her niece were included with the Wilkins family in many of the cultural opportunities that were available in Florence at the time. She also had the opportunity to hear him playing string quartets because Mr. Wilkins was an avid amateur cellist and played string quartets at home. In the course of one of their visits, she impulsively suggested that when he returned to the United States, he come to visit her in Boston so that he could hear the musicales in her home and perhaps even participate, which he agreed to. Come the fall of 1933, he got in touch with her to say, yes, I will be able to come to Boston. Unfortunately, I will not be able to bring my cello. And this led to a remarkable hours conversation that in the end began this entire project, because she went to Louis Krasner's apartment and asked him about borrowing a cello. Well, Louis needed to know a little bit more about this, so he asked her, what sort of a cello does your friend play on? Well, as evidence of how much she was learning about the world of violins, she knew very clearly that he played on a Rogeri cello. Well, this created a problem because Rogeris are very fine instruments, and there are not that many people in Boston in 1933 who owned that quality of instrument or would be willing to lend it out to an unfamiliar person. So he discussed all of this with her, and in the course of the conversation, they discussed about the various makers and the various great makers of cellos. At one point, she interrupted him and said, "Who was the greatest violin maker?" And he responded, of course, Antonio Stradivari. To which she responded, "Can we get a Stradivari cello?" And this took him back because there's a handful of Stradivari cellos. Very few are ever available on the market at any given moment. And he explained all this to her, and in the course of this remembered that several years earlier, he had been in London and had visited Alfred Hill at W.E. Hill & Sons, the great violin dealers. Mr. Hill showed him a very beautiful cello that had just come into their possession. And he thought perhaps Mr. Hill would be willing to sell it. Mrs. Whittall was perfectly in agreement and said, "Can we send him a telegram?" Well, sending a telegram was complicated, and it was difficult to express the ideas in so many words in the form of just a telegram. At which point she said, "Why don't we call him?" Now, this is 1933. International telephone calls were not a commonplace thing. But they picked up the phone, and Louis placed a call to W.E. Hill & Sons, and in time had Alfred Hill on the phone. He explained the purpose, that Mrs. Whittall wished to acquire a very fine cello for the use of a close friend, and he knew of this cello that Hill had, and would he be willing to sell it? And in order to sweeten the deal, so to speak, suggested that perhaps she would be acquiring an entire quartet, to which she readily agreed, at which point Mr. Hill said, "Well, I do have this one cello that you saw, and I would be willing to sell it for $35,000, which was quite a princely sum at the time. Mrs. Whittall agreed instantly, and her only question was, how quickly can we have it? So in the course of the conversation, it was agreed the cello would be purchased for $35,000. Mr. Hill reduced the price to $34,000 and included in the price a Tourt cello bow. He gave his agreement on the phone, which was quite adequate, and the phone call done, the only procedure was to send the money off to London. Mr. Hill promised to get the cello there promptly, and it was available it was already in Boston by the end of December. Now, the idea of creating the quartet really gained inspiration at that point. She was intrigued by this idea and asked, where can we find the other instruments? So Louis Krasner contacted Hill again and asked about appropriate violins. And Mr. Hill suggested that there was actually a very beautiful and very outstanding violin known as the Ward that was the property of an old client and friend, a violinist in Brooklyn named Nathan Posner. So he put Louis in touch with Nathan Posner, and the agreement was made, and in December, that violin was also acquired. In the course of it, Nathan discovered that Mrs. Whittall had already acquired the Castelbarco cello. Now, Nathan Posner also owned one of the Castelbarco violins that had formed the quartet that the Count Cesare Castelbarco of Milan had owned during the early part of the 19th century. So that was proposed as the second violin, and indeed that purchase was made the following February. In course of conversations that continued all through this period, the question, of course, became of getting a viola, now that you had the two violins and the cello. But also, she was curious about the greatest Stradivari's, and she asked, what is the greatest Stradivari? And Louis Krasner responded, well, it's the Messiah Stradivari. Can that be purchased, she asked. No, that's in the Ashmolean Museum. What is the second best Stradivari, she then asked. That would be a violin known as the Betz of 1704, which was legendary for its perfection and its beautiful tone. Can we buy that one? Well, perhaps so. So once again, a communication was made to Mr. Hill, and it turns out that both the viola and the Betz were available right close by in the possession of a man named John Roberts, an insurance executive in Hartford, Connecticut. An appointment was made, and Louis went to Hartford to see the instruments, and in the course of the conversations with Mr. Roberts, approached him about buying the instrument. In fact, about buying both of them together. Now, Roberts had been considering selling the instrument for a while, but was only willing to do so for really a world record price. And he thought about it and responded, "I will sell them both for $150,000. This was unheard of sums for a violin in those days. Mrs. Whitall did not flinch, immediately agreed to the purchase, and so money was wired to Mr. Krasner's accounts. He had a check drawn up. He delivered it to Mr. Roberts and went to Boston with the viola, the Cassavetes viola, and the Betz violin. So now Mrs. Whitall had a quintet of Stradivari's. Since acquiring the Castelbarco, Mr. Wilkins was overwhelmed by the instrument. It became legendary in the Boston area. Everybody wanted to attend the musicales, and everybody wanted to see the Castelbarco cello. Well, this only increased with the collection of the 5 instruments. However, she had already expanded her vision, and now she wanted a string quartet to perform regularly on these instruments, to become something of a resident quartet touring. And so Louis Krasner was able to assemble a quartet of very fine musicians. At her insistence, he was the first violinist. And in the spring of 1934, they began rehearsing and spent the summer in Switzerland, rehearsing and working on repertoire. Now, Louis Krasner had been an active supporter of modern music, and in the course of that visit, he went to London, first of all, and he had Mr. Hill endorse over to Mrs. Whitall all of the certificates for all of the instruments that he had acquired on her behalf. But he also went to Vienna to meet with some of the contemporary musicians, and he became a very good friend of the composer Alban Berg. In conversation, he asked Berg if he would compose a violin concerto for him, and Berg agreed. So with this in mind, Louis Krasner then went back, and the quartet returned to Boston, or rather, I should say they returned to Washington, because during the summer, Mrs. Whitall had moved to Washington to be closer to her very close friend, Mr. Wilkins, and his family, and was already building a network of friends in Washington, in part by attending concerts that were taking place here in the Coolidge Auditorium. At which point, then another plan started to develop for her. Now, meanwhile, the quartet worked over the winter, and in the spring they went back to Switzerland, but things were clearly not proceeding well. There were personality conflicts. There was some disagreements on musical interpretation. During that time in Switzerland, Berg notified Krasner that he'd actually completed the violin concerto. Krasner went to pick it up, explained to Berg that he was in the middle of a very big project involving a string quartet, and so Berg agreed, "You can wait until 1937 for the premiere." Fair enough. When they got back to the States, though, in the fall of 35 rather, it was clear that the quartet was simply not going to function, and they disbanded. Now, any hope of actually rebuilding the quartet was dashed when Berg died in December of 35, and the family decided that they should push forward the premiere to the following spring. In December of 1935, Mrs. Whitall contacted the librarian of the Library of Congress and asked whether she might donate to the library the Betz, the Castelbarco violin, the Cassavetes viola, and the Castelbarco cello, that they be used in concerts at the library. And the offer was accepted. The instruments were delivered in February of the next year. In the course of the year's concerts that she attended, she had a change of concept again. She felt that more variety was needed in the group, and that the Ward violin should join them so that the players could choose between those instruments and best find the personality of sound that they were seeking. And so in January of 1937, the Ward joined them. But this was not the end of the story, because she also realized they needed a very good location in order to be stored properly. And so she gave money to create the pavilion that adjoins the Coolidge Auditorium, which was completed in early 1939. But more critically, she made a major donation to create a foundation to provide, both for the care and maintenance of the instruments, a promotion of performances on those instruments, and of the promotion of chamber music in general, and of course also for the broadcasts of concerts performed on those instruments to a wider audience. After a year of performances by various quartets, she realized that it was a little bit too difficult for many of these quartets to be able to adapt on short notice to the instruments. Better to have one ensemble that knew them well. And so in late 1938, the Budapest Quartet was brought in as the premier quartet in the United States at the time, but now to be the quartet in residence at the Library of Congress, to give a regular series of concerts, all broadcast, performing on the Stradivari instruments that Mrs. Whittall had given. In 1962, the Budapest disbanded, and they were replaced by the Juilliard Quartet, which continued up into the 21st century. Let me speak a little bit about the instruments themselves. The Betz violin of 1704 was singled out by the Hills in their landmark book on Stradivari, published in 1902, as one of the greatest Stradivari instruments in existence. And it also was the result of an extraordinary bargain. Around 1825, a gentleman's servant approached the shop of Betz in London, and meeting Mr. Arthur Betz, who was one of the partners of the firm, said, "I would like to sell this violin," and set on the table in front of him a virtually brand new Stradivari instrument. Mr. Betz looked at it, and being sure of what it was, asked him, "How much do you want?" And his response was 1 guinea, which was a gold coin in regular use in England in those days. Its value was £1 and 1 shilling, 21 shillings. And Mr. Betz simply pulled a guinea coin out of his pocket and handed it to him, and that was that. Now, this ended up breaking up the Betz business, because Arthur Betz was not the least bit interested in sharing his acquisition with his partner, and so they went their separate ways. But Mr. Betz kept it for a number of years, eventually sold it, and it eventually made its way to Paris, where it came into the possession of Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume, one of the greatest dealers and violin makers in France, in Paris, during the 19th century. Vuillaume sold it to a noted collector named Charles Wilmot, who was a resident of Antwerp. Wilmot was creating a Stradivari quartet. He kept it for some time and then sold it to one of his local friends, a man by the name of Caspar Meyer. In 1878, Meyer decided to sell the instrument. He took it to W.E. Hill & Sons, and Hill sold it to a gentleman named the Duc de Camposalis from Paris. Now, the Duke was actually from rather humbler origins. He was the son of a shoemaker from the Netherlands, who had become an outstanding musician, had studied at the Brussels Conservatory, and had encountered a beautiful young widow named Isabella, who was the widow of Isaac Singer of the sewing machine fame. She had a fortune, an inheritance. They set about enjoying the inheritance, and in the course of it, the Duke acquired a quartet of Stradivari instruments, including the Betz. However, their bliss was rather short. In 1887, the Duke died unexpectedly, and in 1892, she sold the violin back to Hills. It passed through several more hands before Hills sold it in 1898 to a Robert Waddell from Glasgow, who owned a large sausage factory, apparently a very significant enterprise in its day. Waddell kept it for quite a number of years. He used it in a way as promotion for his business, lending it out to prominent musicians at the time. But in 1923 decided he was going to sell his entire collection and wanted to try to achieve a world record price. And the top bidder was the Rudolf Wurlitzer Company in New York City. So the Betts, along with the Leduc Guarneri, which was an instrument that, on which Henry Shearing made his career, and several other fine instruments, including Montagnana, that was the instrument through which Louis Krasner and Gertrude Whitall got to know one another, to Wurlitzer. Wurlitzer sold the Betts to Mr. Roberts, I mentioned before, John Roberts, an insurance executive from Hartford. And Roberts kept it as his private violin for a number of years until that fateful day in 1934 when he sold it to Louis Krasner. The next violin in the collection is the Ward of 1700, which is considered still an outstanding example of that period and extremely well preserved. Its history is much shorter. It went from the Goding collection, a great English collection, in 1839 through various hands and eventually belonged to a man named John Ward, of whom we know very little except that his name has been attached to this violin ever since. In 1907, it made its way to Hills, and Hills sold it to an individual who passed it on to Arthur Beer. Arthur Beer sold the violin to Nathan Posner, who then in December of 1933 sold it to Louis Krasner for the quartet. The third violin is the Castelbarco, dating from around 1699. In 1862, it was part of the collection of Count Cesare Castelbarco of Milan. However, in that year, the Count decided to sell his collection, and it was taken to London, where it was sold by the premier auctioneer of the time, Puttock and Simpson. The violin, as indeed most of the fine instruments, were acquired for Vuillaume by his agent in London, and it was sold by Vuillaume to a private individual. It came back to him and was sold to a Scottish dealer named David Laurie. Laurie actually sold it to Richard Wagner, but the German dealers were very jealous of this transaction, and they cast doubt upon the violin, and so Laurie ended up refunding the money and taking the violin back. Well, W.E. Hill & Sons had no doubts whatsoever about the violin, and so they bought it, and in 1874, they sold it to a rather interesting individual by the name of John Mountford. John Mountford ran a pub on Edgware Road. He counted among the leading musicians of England as his clientele, including, as it turns out, the Hills themselves. Mountford loved music, and he loved to play. And he acquired the Castelbarco as his violin, and actually, later on, acquired alongside it the Chrysler Guarneri, which shares space with the Castelbarco at the library to this day. In 1906, Mountford's family sold his collection, and they sold the Castelbarco to a Mrs. Renton in Guildford, in the suburbs of London. In 1928, she sold it to Beers, who also sold it to Nathan Posner. And of course, then it went from Posner to Mrs. Whitall by way of Louis Krasner. The viola was the most difficult element. There are 12 known violas by Antonio Stradivari. Very few of them were ever available at any given moment. And in 1934, there were essentially no violas to be had, except, as it turns out, this one. Now, it went through several hands beforehand, but its name, Cassavetes, comes from the man who acquired it in 1875, a man named Alexander Cassavetes. The Cassavetes were grain merchants from Greece who had settled in London, and Alexander was a student at the university who was an amateur violist and apparently very talented, and he bought the viola for his own use. In 1885, he was induced to sell it because Hills was in the process of assembling a string quartet for a prominent collector named Charles Oldham, who was from Brighton. And he had wanted to create a string quartet, and the Cassavetes formed the instrument. However, the Cassavetes proved to be a bridesmaid several times before it became a bride. Charles Oldham discovered in 1891 that the decorated Stradivari viola that has been part of the Spanish court collection could be had, and he bought that in place of the Cassavetes, at which point the Hills sold the Cassavetes to one of the most celebrated collectors of the 19th and early 20th century, Baron Johann Knoop, who was living in London at the time. However, Baron Knoop in 1898 was given the opportunity to buy the MacDonald Stradivari, which was more in date-wise appropriate to the instruments in his quartet. So the Cassavetes came back to Hills, at which point it was sold to an individual named Robert Brand. In 1928, it came into the hands of the dealer John Hart. And that's when it made its excursion to the United States through the vehicle of Rodman Wanamaker. Wanamaker was the son of the founder of the John Wanamaker department stores, which at that time was one of the preeminent department stores in the world in the category with Marshall Fields, with Harrods, with Selfridges, the great stores anywhere. And Rodman Wanamaker was able to feed two pleasures at once. He could collect a great ensemble of the world's finest instruments and have music with them, and he could promote his store at the same time. So what Wanamaker did was to start buying as many of the great classic instruments as possible. He built a beautiful Egyptian Revival concert hall in his flagship store in Philadelphia. He bought a license for radio broadcasts and began broadcasting nationwide with his ensemble, which was called La Capella. But he wanted to have a viola, and through his concertmaster, Thaddeus Rich, he was able to acquire the Cassavetes, which sailed over on the Aquitania in January of 1928. Unfortunately, this was the last purchase, because in March of 1928, Rodman Wanamaker died. And the business then passed to a board of overseers, and the overseers decided in the end that this was too far away from the mission of the store, and so they authorized Thaddeus Rich to sell the collection, which he did to the Rudolf Wurlitzer Company in 1929, just before the Depression. Wurlitzer's very quickly was able to sell the Cassavetes to that same John Roberts who had acquired the Betts some years earlier. And this is how the two instruments came to be together. Lastly, we have the quartet partner of the Cassavetes violin, the great cello of 1697, one of the most beautifully preserved Stradivari instruments, and one of very few of the early years that has not been reduced to modern proportions. As I mentioned, this was part of the collection of Count Castelbarco in Milan, was sold through the Puttick and Simpson sale, went into Vuillome's hands. Vuillaume sold it to an individual named Egidio Fabri, who was living in Rome at the time. Now, there's a strong American connection with the Fabris, because the brothers Ernesto and Egidio Fabri had come to New York in 1851 to get involved in shipping. And they had gotten involved in a major shipping company that was one of the premier import-export dealers of its time. But Egidio Fabri had become involved in finance, and they'd become very close to Drexel and Lambert, and most importantly, John Pierpont Morgan. So when Morgan started his financial enterprise, Fabri was one of the principals. Now, Ernesto Fabri had died, leaving a family. Egidio adopted them. And in 1883, he retired from the business and he moved back to Italy, taking the family with him. The cello he gave to one of Ernesto Fabri's daughters for her husband from the De Piccolellis family of Florence. And Ottavio De Piccolellis played that instrument for some years. After his death, it was passed on to one of his brother-in-law, Egisto. Egisto was a very talented painter and musician and sculptor, and initially became an artist, living and working in Paris before the war. After the war, he decided to move back to New York, where he'd been born, and he took the cello with him. And he became an architect there, and many of the palaces along Fifth Avenue were actually of his design. Now, late in life, he converted to Roman Catholicism and decided to move back to Italy, at which point the cello was delivered to an astonished Rudolf Wurlitzer company, which had no idea that there was a Stradivari cello in the United States, and they acquired it with the assistance of W.E. Hill and Sons. After a year on the market with no buyers, Hills decided they would rather keep it, and so they bought out Wurlitzer's share, and they took the instrument back to London, which was where it was when it was first encountered by Louis Krasner. And so this whole collection came from these various backgrounds and all coalesced with Mrs. Whitall, and is now the legacy of the nation. And let us look back on music in the days in which she was first beginning this enterprise. As I mentioned, there were just a handful of professional quartets. The Franzollet Quartet had functioned under the sponsorship of a noble who was their patron. A handful of other quartets around the world were able to make a career as performers. The premier group, of course, was the Budapest Quartet, which in 1938 settled in the United States, where it became our premier quartet and the premier quartet at this institution. There was very little exposure to the string quartet repertoire in general, but Mrs. Whitall felt that needed to change. And her ideas with the foundation was to make this music available to all, so that all people could learn to love string quartets the way she did. And the result of all those broadcasts is what we have today. We have more amateur musicians playing string quartets simply for love of the repertoire than at any time in the history of the medium. We have more fine professional quartets, including the one that you will hear adjoining this broadcast. We've had an immense growth of young ensembles who have grown up loving string quartets and wishing to make this their musical destiny. More than ever in history, we are hearing a wonderful ensemble here, the Calidore Quartet. They have many colleagues around the world who are also performing and making careers as professional string quartets. And all of this really is the legacy of Mrs. Whitall. Louis Krasner was very strong about this. He felt very strongly that what we have today was entirely the result of her beneficence and her gift to the nation in the form of these instruments and the foundation that supports them. I must give credit to some very helpful sources and good friends who have provided access to the information that I share with you today. First and foremost, I must mention the library, which has given me access to the papers and documents attached to the gift of the collection and its support over the years. Regarding the remarks I will make concerning Mrs. Whittall's collecting and her association with Louis Krasner, I owe this entirely to the Krasner Archive, at Harvard University, which information was shared with me by a good friend, Carla Chapreau, who has come across this in her own researches. And so our nation now possesses this wonderful ensemble and this wonderful music, which has become very much a part of our daily life, and we owe all of this to Mrs. Gertrude Clark Whitall. It's a debt that we can never repay, except to pass along her love of the quartet to those around us and to the next generation.